Hawaii, 1893. The Hawaiian archipelago was united in 1810 under the Kingdom of Hawaii and its king, but having endured a British takeover in 1843, the Kingdom of Hawaii ceded Pearl Harbor and enacted a free trade agreement with the U.S. to protect themselves from the British. However, under King Kalakaua, the Hawaiian government and constitution was slowly undermined and fractured by foreign businessmen who saw the Hawaiian kingdom as ripe for exploitation. Rights for native Hawaiians were slowly taken away and control of the government was slowly handed over to foreign businessmen. After the death of King Kalakaua in 1891, Queen Liliuokalani was placed in power. Queen Liliuokalani's views on her country's concessions to foreign powers was immediately perceived as a threat to businessmen who benefited from privileges granted to them under King Kalakaua. Queen Liliuokalani immediately attempted to restore voting rights and her government's authority, but a group of 12 influential businessmen seceded and declared Hawaii under their control. With approval from the U.S. ambassador to Hawaii, U.S. Marines were landed and surrounded the Queen's residence. Both sides then pleaded to U.S. President Cleveland to support their version of the government, but instead, Cleveland launched an investigation which later found the U.S. guilty of violating international law by attempting to overthrow the Hawaiian government. Cleveland then demanded for Queen Liliuokalani to be restored to power, but the coup plotters instead took the Queen prisoner and founded the Hawaiian Republic. The Hawaiian Republic would then go on to rule for 2 more years before being annexed by the U.S. in 1898. Cuba, 1998 to 1902. In 1895, Cuban efforts for independence were renewed and hostilities were re-established between Spain and the rebels, but civilian casualties soon mounted as the Spanish command moved hundreds of thousands of civilians to concentration camps where food was scarce and diseases were rampant. Although a smart military move to counter the rebel hit-and-run tactics, this move was a political disaster as it was easily used by the Cuban rebel sympathizers to rustle anger against the Spanish government in the United States. Thus, when Spain and the U.S. went to war, one of the main goals of the U.S. was to overthrow the Spanish government in the Americas and liberate Cuba. Once the Spanish government was overthrown in Cuba, Cuba was forced to secede certain rights from its constitution to the United States. Some of the secessions ranged from leasing Guantanamo Bay to leaving a loophole in the Cuban constitution granting the U.S. a right to militarily intervene in Cuba for any reason. With the approval of the concessions by Cuba, the U.S. withdrew its troops from Cuba in 1902. Panama, 1903. Western powers had long sought a way to get goods from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean quickly, thus making the possible opening up of the Panama Zone a big priority for the United States. When a treaty granting the U.S. access to the Panama region failed to be approved by the Colombian Senate in 1903, the U.S. instead opted for orchestrating the independence of the region from Colombia. The U.S. pushed an independence movement in Panama, which in turn led to a rebellion against the Colombian government. Then, through several passive-aggressive maneuvers, the U.S. ensured that Colombia would fail in recapturing the region from rebels, thus leading to the independence of Panama from Colombia and the granting of the Panama Canal Zone to the U.S. indefinitely. Cuba, 1906 to 1909. The rigging of the 1905 election, which re-elected Tomas Estrada Palma as president of Cuba, fueled the rebellion led by his liberal opponent Jose Miguel Gomez. Both sides deemed each other illegitimate and refused to stand down, therefore prompting the U.S. to intervene in Cuba as permitted by the Cuban Constitution. The U.S. used the intervention to restore peace and economic stability as the U.S. relied on Cuban sugar imports by this point. This in turn led to the resignation of President Estrada as the U.S. refused to support his claim to power. The rebels happily disarmed and new elections were held in 1908. Liberal Jose Miguel Gomez was sworn into power in 1909 with approval from the United States. Nicaragua, 1909. President Jose Santos Zelaya had ruled Nicaragua for 16 years, but when a rebellion of conservatives and liberals threatened to topple him, the U.S. joined the fray. The U.S. felt threatened by Zelaya's plans to build a Transmedian Canal through Nicaragua that could rival with the U.S.-built Panama Canal, but the U.S. was unable to garner enough support to topple his regime. This was at least until 2 American mercenaries were executed by Nicaragua. After this event played out in the U.S. media, the U.S. was then able to successfully mount enough military pressure in conjunction with the rebels to get President Zelaya to resign. President Zelaya resigned December 14, 1909. Nicaragua, 1910. Shortly after Zelaya resigned, the Nicaraguan Congress appointed Jose Madriz as president and successor to Zelaya. Unfortunately, Jose Madriz was unable to quell the ongoing political situation and was eventually forced to resign by rebels and the U.S. military. Nicaragua, 1912 to 1925. Finally, a new conservative president was appointed, Juan José Estrada. However, Estrada ended up resigning due to a conflict with his Minister of War for his inability to protect American investments and his failure at quelling conservative and liberal rivalries. Adolfo Diaz was then placed in power. Adolfo then asked for U.S. military assistance to help put down a rebellion against them, as backlash against Diaz mounted for selling out to American interests. The rebels were soon defeated and U.S. troops were stationed in Nicaragua as an occupying force until 1925, with the last U.S. troops leaving in 1933. Mexico, 1913. After dictator Porfirio Diaz was overthrown by Mexican rebels in the Mexican Revolution, President Madero was appointed President of Mexico. Madero then promptly started the monumentous task of reconciling all rebel factions to form a government. However, America's ambassador in Mexico City, Henry Lane Wilson, quickly began sending messages of disapproval up the American chain of command. Wilson believed that Madero was not strong enough to gain control of Mexico, therefore he took it upon himself to aid and take an active role in the coup that overthrew Madero. Wilson was an instrumental part in the coup that placed General Victorian Huerta in power, as he believed stability would secure American investments. General Huerta then began building a repressive military government, to which Mexican revolutionaries countered with another civil war.